to make sure that everyone registered for this session is able to join us. But I can see a growing number. Probably more people than I've seen in this webinar for a good while. So it's brilliant to see, slightly higher number of participants than we've had in the previous weeks. Amazing. Yeah, just final few seconds before we start. So yeah, it's past 6 o'clock now. Let's begin. So once again, and officially, hello and welcome everyone to our Homes for Ukraine Matching Service webinar. As you can see, my name is Tomasz and I'm a training coordinator here at Reset. I'll be your host for the next 45 minutes or so. So a couple of practicalities before we begin and before I take you through our content of the session. Well, first and foremost, something that you might have noticed already, and it is that while hopefully you are able to see and you're able to hear me as well, I am not able to see or to hear any of you. So your cameras are off, your microphones are on mute, and it will remain like that for the duration of our webinar. There is, however, a way for us to communicate. So there is a Q&A button. Usually it is at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes you need to click those three dots that say more to access it, but there is a chat button that you can use to post any questions that you have at any point in today's webinar. And the way this is going to work is I have a presentation that goes on for about 40 minutes, well, depending on how much I talk really and how many things I add to my usual presentation. So yeah, a presentation of about 40 minutes. And straight after that, I'll start answering those questions that you posted in the Q&A. And I will make sure that all of those questions are answered before we finish today's session. So if we have a lot of questions, I'm more than happy to stay beyond 6:45. Of course, you don't have to do the same. So at 6:45, you're so free to go. But I will be here if anyone has any questions that they want to ask, or perhaps if you just want to listen to me answer those questions. Now, our final practicality of today is that straight after today's webinar, you'll get a follow-up email from me, which will include the slides that I'll be using. It will include any useful links or resources that I refer to in this session. So don't feel like you need to remember or note down everything. You'll get all of that into your inbox in that follow-up email. Now, I feel like those are all of the practicalities, in which case, let me share my screen and tell you a little bit more as to what we're going to be doing in today's session. Well, and there are three key parts that we are going to cover in the session. We'll start by looking at the Homes for Ukraine process. So we'll look at the steps you're going to take to become a host, as well as kind of what's involved, what is it that you sign up to do as a host. We will then look at some of the key considerations to make before you make that final decision that you want to go ahead and open up your home to someone like that. We are very aware that that decision is a big one, and we want to make sure that you make it with all the information we can share with you. So we'll talk about some of the considerations before you make that final decision. And then at the very end of today's session, we will talk about the way our matching service works and the next steps after today's webinar. So that's our roadmap for the next 40 minutes or so now. Now, before I start talking to you about that process, I wanted in just a couple of sentences to tell you who we are at Reset, what we do, where our expertise comes from. So as a charity, and we are an independent charity, as a charity, we were set up in 2018 and originally set up to offer training, to offer support, to offer advice to community sponsorship groups. And these are groups of volunteers who come together to welcome refugee families into their communities. And you can actually see one of those groups on the photograph here. Together with the family they are supporting. Now, slight differences between that program and Homes for Ukraine is that those groups have to find a separate, so independent accommodation for the families they welcome from day one. And they also primarily welcome people coming from Syria, to some extent also people coming from Afghanistan as well. So those are some of the differences. But community sponsorship as a program continues still, while also being a bit of a predecessor for Homes for Ukraine, I think. Another program that we've been running is Neighbors for Newcomers. And through this program, refugee nurses arrive to the UK to work for the NHS, and we coordinate what we call a community-led support to those nurses. So we coordinate volunteers who in turn help those nurses get better integrated, help those nurses to, get more familiar with their new local areas. And then on Homes for Ukraine, we've been running a matching service since March. So we, of course, bring together hosts with refugees. We also offer some training, offer some advice. We now run sort of regular events online for hosts. So, check out all of our offer and not just these webinars. But that's it. That's us in a nutshell. And this is where our expertise comes from. And again, I know a couple of people joined just after 6 o'clock. If you have any questions at all, please use the Q&A function to post them. And I will be answering all of the questions at the very end of today's session. So as we go along, post any questions you've got into the Q&A, and I'll make sure all of them are answered before we finish. So a quick note on language that we'll be using. So when I talk about you, I'll be using words like host or sponsor, and I'll be using them interchangeably in this session. When I talk about people coming from Ukraine to stay with you, I'll be using words like newcomers, guests, or refugees. And again, at least in this session, they are synonyms. Now, a note on that word refugees is that while people coming from Ukraine are refugees by definition, so they're fleeing war, they're fleeing conflict to seek safety and shelter here in the UK, they will not be given refugee status when they come to the UK. So the UK government decided to instead offer people 3 years of leave to remain. So that's a technical term for the immigration status that Ukrainians have in the UK. What does it mean? Well, it simply means that they will be able to stay in the UK, they'll be able to work, they'll be able to access free healthcare, children will be able to access education, they will be able to access welfare benefits, and they'll be able to do that for a period of 3 years. So that's what 3 years of leave to remain mean. Now, let's look at the Homes for Ukraine process and the steps you'll be taking to becoming a host. Now, first and foremost, it's about deciding that you want to get involved. And I know what you might be thinking. You signed up to our matching series. You're here, you're listening to me speak. Of course you want to get involved. Now, we'll be looking at some of the considerations to make before you make that final decision to host someone in your home, slightly later on in today's session. But right now, the one thing I wanted to say is that if after listening to today's webinar, someone starts to think, actually, I'm not sure if this is for me. Actually, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable going ahead with this, then that is Absolutely, absolutely fine. There's no pressure for you to go ahead after today's webinar. And as a matter of fact, there are other ways in which you can get involved and help refugees in your area that don't always involve hosting someone in your own home. So, if you still want to help, but perhaps aren't quite prepared to host, then definitely drop us an email and ask us about those other projects that we might be running in your area that I just described. But for the purpose of our session, let's assume you want to go ahead. So the next step is finding someone to sponsor. And this is, of course, where we come in and like I said, we bring together refugees with sponsors here in the UK. So that's our role. One of the things we'll ask you to do when we connect you with a refugee is to take a bit of time to get to know them. So we'll suggest that you arrange a video call, arrange a Zoom call with them, just to maybe find out a little bit more about them, share a little bit more about you, about your area, so that the expectations for a life in the UK are so set. Maybe talk a little bit about your potential guests' expectations for their life here. So yeah, I think that getting to know each other face is sort of really important part of the process. But again, let's assume that things went great. You sort of connected well with the people we sort of matched you with. If that's the case, then the next step is applying for the visa. Now, the visa application is available online on gov.uk website. It is entirely in English, but there are some accompanying notes available in Ukrainian and in Russian. It could be either you as a host or your guest filling out that visa application, but regardless of who is doing this, you and your guest will have to stay in touch as someone is, physically typing away and filling out that application. And that is because the application is going to ask for some information from the host. It's also going to ask for some information from the guests as well. One more thing that the application is going to ask from you as a host is a photograph of the proof of your identity. So if you aren't quite comfortable enough sending that photograph to your potential guests, then it might be that you'll suggest that you will be the one filling out that visa application. So that is certainly something to consider there. Here at Reset, we don't have the legal expertise to offer advice on individual visa applications, but there are now a number of organizations that do that. There are a number of organizations that produce quite extensive sort of guide as to how to navigate that application. And I'm going to link to one of them in the follow-up email that I send you all. Once the visa application is submitted, it triggers information being sent to your local authority. And the local authority is going to do two things to kind of ensure that so as a sponsor, your house is safe, you're sort of suitable, for a lack of better words, to welcome a refugee family. So the first thing that they're going to do is someone is going to physically come around to your house to check that the property is safe. I know it might feel a little bit invasive, but that's a standard part of the process. And the second thing the local authority is going to do is asking everyone in your household, age 16 and over, to apply for DBS checks. And if your guests are coming with children, these will be enhanced DBS checks. So that's the local authority checks. Then once the visa application is approved and your guests get permission to travel letter, it'll be, again, down to you or your guests to arrange transport to the UK. I want to make it very, very clear. There is no expectation on you to pay for your guest transport to the UK. And actually, there are ways in which you or they can arrange it very, very cheaply or almost with no cost at all. So it's really worth doing some research. Some of the things we know about is that Last time I checked, Wizz Air was offering free flights or free seats on certain flights, I should say, for Ukrainian refugees, for example. A number of rail companies all across Europe are offering free transport to Ukrainians. So it's really worth looking into this to arrange the transport as cheaply as possible. And then, your guests arrive into an airport, a train station, perhaps they come straight to your house, depending on what you agree. And that's when your hosting starts. And, that's the exciting part, right? So let's look in a bit more details as to what it means to be a host. So as a host, you'll be offering a minimum, and that is a key word here, a minimum of 6 months of accommodation, and you will not be charging any rent on the property, and that's regardless of whether you offer a separate self-contained accommodation or whether you offer a room in your own home. You will not be charging any rent on either of those. You will, however, get a thank you payment from the government. You'll be £350 per month for as long as your guests stay with you, and for up to 12 months. And it will be £350 regardless of how many people stay with you. Which I know is slightly counterintuitive, and that's what the government decided to do. I know I said I'll answer all of the questions at the very end, but there is a very good question from Elaine about something that I completely forgot to talk about. The question is, who pays for the DBS checks, and is there a cost for the visa? Yeah, thank you for reminding me about that, Elaine. So there is no cost for the host on either of those. So the cost of the DBS checks is covered by the local authority. So they will pay for the DBS checks. You just need to physically fill out the forms. The visa application is completely free of charge, so no one pays for that at all. So no cost on those things to the host. But thanks, Elaine, for reminding me to mention that. Now, back to what it means to host. So you'll be offering a separate bedroom to your guests. Especially at the beginning of this program, quite a lot of people reached out to us, very kindly, offering a sofa in their living room, or offering to share a room with a refugee, or their children sharing a room with a refugee. None of those is allowed under this program. So it needs to be a separate bedroom or bedrooms for your guests' use only. Your guests will have a freedom of movement in your home, or you'll be offering your guests freedom of movement in your home. What do I mean by that? I think it sounds very grand, but actually it's very common sense when we explain that. So it simply means that your guests will have a key to your front door, so that they can come and go as they please. It means that your guests will have access to some of the shared living spaces, like the kitchen, the living room, the bathroom. It means that your guests will be there when you go to work, or when, for example, you go on holiday. So that's what we mean by freedom of movement in your home. You'll be providing some support and guidance to your guests. So your local authority should be offering a wraparound support to your guests with things like opening a bank account, or applying for benefits, although more on this in a second. So your local authority should be offering wraparound support to your guests, and it will be topping up that support by introducing them to the local area, by showing them how the public transport works, perhaps showing them where affordable shops are, or where they might be able to find some culturally recognizable foods. These are some of the things that you'll be doing as a host. Your guests will be registering for benefits and opening bank accounts at your address. So of course, your address will be their main residential address. And as all of this happens, you'll be sort of interacting with your local authority. So now let's look at that local authority role in a little bit more detail. So they'll be doing those safety checks, which I already talked about. They'll also be doing a welfare check on your guest. What does that mean? Well, after the guest arrives, either someone will come round to your house or you'll be invited to like a space the local authority works from, to their offices. And it'll be a conversation with you and your guest separately, just to make sure everything is going well, that the guest feels safe, that you feel okay with all of that. So that's what a welfare check is. The local authority is also going to offer initial cash payments to your guests. So they will be offering £200 per person for every single person that you're hosting. So if you're hosting a mother and two children, it will be £200 for the mother and 200 for each of the kids. Now, why is this in place? This is because even after someone makes an application for the welfare benefits, it usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks for the first payment to be issued. So that initial cash payment is there to bridge that gap and to make sure that your guests have access to at least some funds as they wait for the benefit payments to come through. I can see some questions coming up. Keep them coming. Like I said, I'll answer all of them at the very end, but it's brilliant to see some of the questions here already. The more, the better. That's my favorite part. So keep them coming. Okay. Some of the other things local authority will be doing. They'll be allocating school places for children aged between 5 and 16. They'll be able to offer some advice and referrals to specialist services. So they will know about services that they run themselves, like social services or mental health services, for example. But they could also be a good source of information about some of the charities in the area, some of the non-governmental organizations that can offer help and support to you or your guests working in the area. Like I said, the local authority should be offering help with benefit applications, but I'll talk about my own experience with that in a second. And finally, the local authority is also there as a bit of a safety net when it comes to housing. So when your hosting comes to an end, and if your guests aren't independent enough to be able to find their own accommodation, the local authority is there as a bit of a safety net to make sure that no one is being made homeless as a result of the scheme. So the local authority is a bit of a last resort option, but it is there just in case to prevent homelessness. Another important role of the local authority is rematching. Now, slightly confusingly, and I'm really sorry about that, I'm not happy necessarily that we use rematching to mean two slightly separate things. I didn't quite make the decision, and I think everyone is using it like that. So I'm going to explain what rematching can mean. So the first meaning of the word rematching within context of Homes for Ukraine is in those rare situations where the relationship between a host and the guest breaks down. It is no longer safe, it is no longer appropriate for the guest to stay with that particular host. And the local authority steps in to offer another host to those guests. So that's what rematching can mean. Rematching now also means for those guests who are coming up to the end of their hosting. I mean, the program has been running for 8 months now. So we have more and more people who are coming up to the end of the hosting. For some who are not able to find independent accommodation, it can be them or it can be the local authority looking for another host. And that's what rematching also means. So when you are asked to complete the information on our portal, you'll be asked whether you are up to to be that very much host, and that means being a host to someone who is already in the UK. If that's suggested to you, I would encourage you to sort of ask questions about the circumstances. I think it is quite different, sort of hosting someone whose initial relationship with a host might have broken down. And, I'm not discouraging you from this, but if that's the case, then finding out why that relationship broke down to be important. It's obviously a different story to host someone who's been here for a few months and simply needs a little bit more extra help. So, Loretta, I can see your raised your hand. I think that's the past tense. However, there isn't, like I said, the way for us to communicate is to use the Q&A function. So if there's anything you need, post it there. If you have any questions, equally post it there. That's the only way for us to communicate in this webinar. So yes, that's rematching. Now, this was a bit of a local authority's role in theory. How does it work in practice? Well, let me just. Okay, I can see more questions coming up. Brilliant. Okay, so local authority roles in practice. I'm going to use my own example because I think it portrays well some of the advice, some of the challenges around the role of the local authority. It is worth acknowledging that on this program, the government, without really consulting with the local authorities, so signed them up to do quite a lot. And some of the local authorities are great at offering that wraparound support. Some of the local authorities maybe are struggling for capacity, aren't able to sort of offer as much. So the support from local authority really differs from one local authority to another. Now, my experience was, and admittedly that was quite early on in the lifetime of the project. So my partner's guest arrived so in April this year, so like I said, relatively early on in the lifetime of the project. At that time, that support to apply for benefits, for example, wasn't there. So that was something that I had to do with our guest. However, while that statutory help wasn't quite there, there was a lot of what I would describe as sort of mutual help between hosts. So I live in a very tiny town, and yet there's a WhatsApp group for this town where we sort of connect with one another and exchange experiences. There is a Facebook group for our broader region, and again, people also share resources, people post questions, and there is always someone who has an answer. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to look into those, and maybe more broadly, I feel like I have a bit of a homework for you on this. I would definitely encourage you to check out what your local authority is offering on this program. So by now, every local authority will have a website where it talks about their support. It talks about what it does on Homes for Ukraine. So do go on there and so find out what is it that you and your guest will be able to count on your local authority to do, and what are some of the things that you and them will have to figure out on your own. Equally, look into that sort of mutual help, look into charities in your area, find those WhatsApp groups or Facebook groups or, whatever it is in your area. So that, I think, support locally is so important. So definitely spend some time doing research into this. Now, like I said, we'll have some questions to consider, some of the things to think about before you make that final decision to become a host. So first and foremost, I talked quite a bit about that local authorities involvement in the scheme. How might that feel to you? Is there any chance that you will feel a little bit invasive, perhaps? I know some of the hosts describe it to me like that. It's a normal part of the process, but I know people react to it differently. Our second question, I think, is the biggest one. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time on it. Are you comfortable sharing your home with someone? Uh, and when I talk about that, I often talk about the word guests that we keep using. And I feel a little bit guilty about doing that, but equally, I think it's a sort of accepted word for Ukrainians by now. The reason I feel it's maybe a little bit misleading, especially within the context of that question that I just posed to you all, is that if someone stays with you, if someone lives with you for 6 months or more, then I feel like they're probably no longer a guest in your house. I feel like, in a way, your home becomes their home a little bit too. And so I encourage you to think about perhaps the way you need to adjust for living with someone on that semi-permanent basis. Because I think the relationship you'll have with the people coming to stay with you will be much closer to the relationship we might have with a flatmate, rather than with a guest in your house. So think about the ways you might need to adjust. It could be starting with very small things like making a little bit more space in the fridge so that they have somewhere to keep their stuff. But it might extend to slightly bigger things. I don't know, if you constantly have friends over, often have dinners or host people, consider whether it will be still appropriate when you have, I don't know, a young mother and a child living with you. I'm not saying it's not appropriate, but I think it's something worth considering. We would certainly encourage you to make that decision to host a whole household decision. So definitely talk with other people living with you, talk with your children. I think even talk with people who stay over at your house quite often about how everyone will be impacted and how everyone might need to adjust to living with your guests. Our next question, do you know where to find support locally? If your answer is no, I've got no idea, then it's your time to do a bit of research and find out. Are you willing to help navigate systems in other languages? I feel like this question may be even broadened to, are you prepared to live with someone who doesn't speak English fluently? A lot of people arriving to the UK, they speak either a little bit of English, some speak no English at all. On our system, you can choose whether you are prepared to host someone with no English at all, and we'll definitely respect that. But still, I think the likelihood that you'll have someone who speaks perfect English is very low. So think about that and think about how confident you are communicating with someone who perhaps doesn't speak English great. The take-up of COVID-19 vaccinations in Ukraine is lower than it is in the UK. So again, consider how might you feel living with someone with for example, different vaccination status. And finally, think about living with someone with a different parenting style or a different culture. I think the example I often give is, imagine that as you're a parent who has very good boundaries around how much sugar your children eat, and your guests arrive and they have none of those boundaries. They're, kids eat loads and loads of sugar. I think as long as everyone is safe, as long as you're not being made uncomfortable in your own home, decisions around parenting or like different culture are the ones that our guests can make, and we shouldn't be there to judge as hosts. So that is something to be prepared for as well. So think about all of this before you make your final decisions as to whether you definitely want to go ahead, or perhaps if you want to get involved into something else. Couple of things that we've learned from this project so far. Now, first and foremost, we learned that sometimes hosts have a very specific idea as to who they want to host. So what happens sometimes is we match someone with a mother and a 15-year-old son. And the host gets back to us and says, actually, I was really hoping to be matched with a mother and a 40-year-old girl. Would that be possible? In that situation, we would have to get back to that mother and the 15-year-old, tell them that that match fell through, and sort of offer them alternatives, which could be, really disappointing. So as much as it is possible, I encourage you to keep an open mind as to who it is you're going to host. Don't get me wrong. There will be things where you need to be specific and you need to sort of know what you can and cannot accept, like, someone with pets, someone who smokes, those things, of course, you need to be clear about. But when it comes to exactly who it is you're going to host, as much as it is possible, I encourage you to keep an open mind. And that brings me to the second thing that we learned, and that's that we see quite a broad range of people arriving to the UK through this scheme. So of course, women and women with children are the majority of those coming through, but we also see all adult family units. So it could be a 50-year-old daughter with her 70-year-old father. It could be men sometimes, because some men are exempt from military service and are able to leave Ukraine. So yeah, there is a broad range of people. And final thing that we learned is that very many people prefer to be in towns and cities, and that's so that they are close to job opportunities, to support services, maybe to their own friends and family. So if you are in a rural location, I'm not saying you won't be able to host, but it might take us a little longer to match you with someone. So how does our matching service work? Well, first and foremost, we are very aware that being a refugee means being devoid of agency, being devoid of choice, devoid of control over your own life. And that is why we decided to place refugees at the center of our matching service. So it is refugees who are originally offered sort of different choices of sponsors. And when a refugee chooses you as their preferred sponsor, that is when we reach out to you and say, hey, Mila and her 15-year-old boy, Andrei, chose you as their sponsor. Here is a little bit more information about them. Are you happy for us to connect you to so that you can arrange that initial online meeting? Now, while refugees are kind of at the center of our service, we really want everyone to make informed decision. We really want for all of the matches to be mutually agreed. So if after that initial meeting, something isn't quite right, you don't feel like you're going to connect, you don't feel like you're going to match well, definitely let us know, and we'll never push you, never force you to go ahead. We'll always offer you some alternative matches in that situation. So definitely let us know at any point if you're concerned about anything. So again, the way that the system works is we offer 2 options of sponsors to refugees, and we give them 5 days to make their decision. And in that time, both of those options of sponsors are sort of held for that refugee. So we wait for them to decide. We never often offer the same sponsor to multiple refugees at the same time. If they say yes, then we send you an email with the details of a refugee and ask you for permission to connect you. If they say no, then we offer them some alternative matches. Now, I have to very quickly change my presentation from one to another because we had a small problem. And for some reason, one of the slides is no longer in our presentation. And it's quite an important one. So let me make sure we have that covered. So on your end, apart from the email you are going to receive from me this evening, you're also going to receive another email from our matching service. It will be an automated email that should arrive in your inbox around 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And by the way, I'm very aware I've been speaking for a while now, but this part is important. So please, if you can master just a couple more minutes of focus, and I promise, that don't have long left, but this part is really important. So you'll get an automated email prompting you to populate your sponsor profile. So you'll be asked to update your household details. So you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about your household, who lives in your home, and if you have anything that you won't be able to accept. Like, for example, someone said that they have a pond in the garden and they aren't able to accept any small children. This is the information that our matching team used to match refugees with hosts. This is also the information that the refugees are going to see. So bear that in mind when writing those household details. So if there's anything you can or cannot accept, this is the space where you can let us know. There is also a short paragraph about your area, and especially if you live in a rural location, make sure you expand on it. So some of the things to talk about are, how is the public transport? How long does it get to a nearest town or a city? How frequent it is? Are there any Ukrainians living in the area? Are there any services for Ukrainians? Like, I live in a tiny town, and yet the nearest English class is a 5-minute walk from our house. So I think we see that more and more services are being set up in those rural spaces. But definitely talk about that if you know of anything in the paragraph about your area, especially if you are in a rural location. And then at the bottom of your profile page, there will be open to matches field. And if you are open to us matching you with someone right now, then please tick the box. So after and as soon as you tick the box, you will appear on our service, on our system, as someone open to matches. And this is when our matching team will start offering you as a potential match to refugees. If for whatever reason you aren't open to matches right now, so I know we're approaching Christmas and some people say, actually, I want to host, but I want to host after Christmas. If you're maybe talking to someone already on another platform, whatever it is, if you aren't open to being matched with someone right now, then please make sure that you don't tick that box and only tick that when you're actually prepared to be connected with someone. Because what happens sometimes is we match a host with a refugee, and only when we approach the host, they tell us, actually, I'm not ready to host. It might be a few weeks, it might be a couple of months before I'm ready. And again, that's when we need to offer alternative matches to refugees. So next steps after today's session, do a little bit of research into your local area, what support is available, what your local authority is doing. Think about the information I've talked about, think about the questions that I posed, and don't feel pressure to go ahead if you feel like that's not for you. If you have more questions, I am now going to start going through the Q&A section, so please post them there. Also, you can respond to my follow-up email and ask any questions you've got by email as well. Please make sure that the decision to host is a whole household decision, so consult others. And remember about that other follow-up email you're going to get at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And remember to populate your sponsor profile and tick that box that you're open to matches, if indeed you are open to matches right now. Okay, that's my presentation done. I feel like every time I do it, it's slightly longer. So we are almost at 6:45. Now, like I promised, I don't want to keep anyone longer than they wanted to be here. So if anyone needs to go, please feel free to do so at any point from now. But if you want to stay, like I said, it's the question and answer time. So I'm going to go through our Q&A section now, one by one. If you have more questions, please feel free to keep posting them there. And like I said, I'll make sure all of them are answered before we wrap up. And I see quite a few questions, which is brilliant, because like I said, it genuinely is my favorite part of this webinar. Okay, so Nick asks, hi, I have a dog who does not like males too much, and he was abused when was a puppy. So how would I go about that? I don't want to lock him in my room all day. So Nick, I think there are a couple of things, and that reminds me about one of the principles we use in our matching service. So first and foremost, maybe it's worth saying that following UN Refugee Agency guidance, we will never match a single male with a single female. So either way, we won't match a single female refugee with a single male host. We also won't match single female host with a single male refugee. I appreciate that might have worked for very many people, but like I said, the guidance from UN Refugee Agency is not to do that, and we decided to follow that. Nick, making an assumption that's a male name, although I definitely know female Nicks too. You can definitely let us know that you aren't able to accept male guests. However, if you happen to be a single male, that might be tricky because of that. The principle that we've got. But other than that, if there are things that you cannot accept, definitely let us know in the household details section. And we really want for the matches to be good ones. So we'll always take that into consideration. And, if I think being in a position where you would have to lock your dog every single day because you leave with a male guest, I think it doesn't sound like that would be a good idea or a long-term thing either. So yeah, definitely let us know about things like that. Anthony asks, can you choose the guest that stays with you in the property? So I think that question was asked before I described how our matching service works. So you have a degree of choice, but the refugees are sort of given the first choice, as it says. You can say no, but you will not be given a list of guests from which you can choose. However, we do have a very skilled matching team that proposes matches based on their expertise, and we so pride ourselves in putting quite a lot of effort into making matches that really make sense. So hopefully that will work for you. Elaine asks, can a child share a room with a mother, or does a child have to have a separate room? So Elaine, UK has a very specific guidance around this. We have a simple video that we put together to explain that to hosts, and I'm going to include a link to it in the follow-up email. But in short, a child under 10 can share a room with their parent, assuming that the room is large enough. So there's a guidance as to exactly how many square feet the room has to be. I don't quite remember that number. It doesn't have to be massive, but there is a minimum requirement. A child older than 10 cannot share a room with an adult. So there are a few rules like this, but hopefully that answers the question. Loretta asks, did you mention, you did mention that refugee will stay 6 months, the government pays 350 for 12 months. So what happens after those 12 months? So just to recap that, so the thank you payments go on for up to 12 months, and as long as your guests stay with you. You'll be hosting your guests for a minimum of 6 months. So the hosting can go on for longer, but the minimum is 6 months. What happens beyond those 12 months? I mean, the idea is that by then your guests will be independent enough to rent their own accommodation. We are waiting for the government to issue some more guidance on what happens beyond 12 months. This has been delayed because of the changes to the government, but there will be some more guidance on it. All we know is what I said earlier around those payments going for 12 months and not more at the moment. Wendy asks, do the newcomers have to have DBS checks too? So Wendy, they will not be DBS checks per se, because DBS only check UK criminal convictions. So of course, someone who has never been to the UK or only came as a tourist wouldn't be able to get one, but there will be security checks on the guests. I guess comparable to DBS, but extending beyond the UK. So there are definitely safety and security checks on guests as well as the hosts. How often does the local authority meet with the newcomers, and do the hosts always have to be present at these meetings? So my own experience is that I was present at the one meeting, that initial welfare check. That was very early on as well, so I don't think my guest would have been able to navigate her way to that space. I think that happened like few days, like only a couple of days after she arrived. After that, we have a sort of a welcome hub in our town that is now organized by the local authority, that arranges some meetings for the guests, but I don't go to any of them. So for me, it was just the one meeting. I don't think there'll be a requirement for you to attend anymore, but how often and how much support there is from the local authority to your guests will depend on the local authority. So I would encourage you to look into that. Will there be extra English lesson courses for Ukrainians to go to? Sheila, that's a very good question. And again, I'm afraid that really depends on the area. So, well, I think pretty much everywhere new courses have been set up, but how available there are quite depends on the area. So I know in our local town, it was quite difficult to get a space to begin with. It took a little while. So in the interim, our guests studied online in one of the courses that, one of the online schools that can be accessed. So again, that is something to look into, unfortunately for you as a host, because it's it differs so much from one area to another. Sorry, that's a slightly frustrating answer. Is the Ukrainian driving license valid here? So if someone has international driving license issued in Ukraine, it'll be valid for 1 year. And after that, someone will have to pass the UK's driving license test and get British license. But in the first year, they will be able to drive here in the UK. Loretta asks, what is our email address? So it is, I can tell you this, but also you'll get a follow-up email from our email address. You'll have that by getting the follow-up email. It's homes for Ukraine at resetuk, all one word, .org. So homes for Ukraine at resetuk.org. But you'll have that email address as soon as you get the follow-up email from me just after this session. So literally after this, the next thing I'm going to do is that email. Can hosting have any effect on home insurance? Ashley, yeah, that is a very good and important question. And the answer to this is that it shouldn't. It shouldn't affect things like single persons, or it definitely doesn't affect things like single persons council tax discount. It shouldn't affect your insurance, but we always advise you to check with your insurer just to make sure. For sure, it shouldn't happen. How long can I take between the email tomorrow and making a decision to host? So there isn't a deadline. If you aren't sure, and if you want to take more time to decide whether you want to host or not, you can just fill out your sponsor profile, but not tick that open to matches box. And as long as it's not ticked, we'll not be offering you as a potential match to refugees. So you can keep it as close to matches for as long as you want, really. And if you do, we'll probably send you an email from time to time to prompt you and to see whether you might be interested in hosting. That's automated. That's just how our system works. But there is no, you can take as long as you want, really. So a follow-up from Nick, but I think there isn't a question there. So Anthony, how can those people in Ukraine find out about the relocation and asylum service? So just to be very clear, Anthony, if you mean our matching service or any other matching services, then it's of word of mouth. But we do have loads and loads of people from Ukraine registering with us. As a matter of fact, we have by far more people from Ukraine registering with us than sponsors. On that note, if you have any friends, if you have anyone interested in hosting, definitely send us our way. We're always in sort of need and in search for more hosts. So like I said, it's sort of word of mouth. We've been posting on different Telegram groups. But by now, I think we, as well as other matching services, are pretty known and popular in Ukraine. Have you matched many guests and sponsors in Northern Ireland? And is the process very different from England? So we certainly have matched guests and sponsors in Northern Ireland. I think the main difference is around the main support coming from Northern Ireland executive rather than from the local authority. I think maybe that depends on the region, but I know at least in some places they sort of commissioned different organizations to do checks for them. I know Bernardo's was doing that in some places in Northern Ireland. But I think the key principles are the same. So there are still checks. I know there aren't DBS checks per se in Northern Ireland, but there are similar type of criminal checks that you need to go through. Sorry, I forgot the name. I think NI Access is the name of the criminal checks in Northern Ireland. So yeah, the principles are the same. They'll be done by the Northern Ireland executive rather than local authority. You'll be Northern Ireland Access rather than DBS checks, but the main things are the same, and we certainly sort of match sponsors or refugees in Northern Ireland as well. Okay, it sounds like that's all the questions. Well, in that case, thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Well, have an amazing rest of the day. Have a great evening, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining, and look out for those follow-up emails from me and our matching service. Bye. Cheerio.